Fact-check warnings appear on tweets by Donald Trump. The US president and his supporters say it's another attempt to censor conservative voices. With an election just 6 months away, can social media companies balance freedom of speech while rooting out misinformation? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Donald Trump is often called the tweeter-in-chief. Twitter is the US president's main social media platform. It's where he announces policies to more than 80 million followers, and where he's attacked opponents and spread misinformation. Twitter is now in the president's firing line. It's placed a fact-check warning on 2 Trump tweets that falsely claimed postal ballots would lead to voter fraud. The president accused Twitter, in a tweet, of stifling free speech and silencing conservative voices. The White House says Trump is preparing to sign an executive order to review a law that protects social media. Under Section 230 of the US Communications Decency Act, online platforms are largely exempted from liability for content created by their users. They have the freedom to remove content without facing lawsuits. Critics of the law say it allowed platforms to avoid responsibility for harmful content posted on their pages, including hate speech and election-related material. A review would look into whether social media companies deceive people by picking and choosing what content to block, and provide a way for people to report online censorship. But Twitter has been criticised for refusing to act on other Trump tweets. For example, the president repeated a debunked conspiracy theory that a TV host and former congressman was involved in the death of an intern 19 years ago. Despite calls to remove the posts, Twitter said they don't violate its terms of service. Let's bring in our guests, all in the United States. In Alexandria, we have Adolfo Franco, a former advisor to Senator John McCain and a Republican strategist. In Washington, D.C., Derrick Plummer, Democratic strategist and former regional press secretary for the Democratic National Committee. And in New York, Jim Anderson, chief executive of Social Flow, a technology firm dealing with social media content for companies. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Jim, if I can begin with you first of all. This review that Donald Trump is suggesting, how would it affect what people can see online on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter?
Well, I think immediately it would not affect it at all, right? He's talking about a review, which implies a period of time. It's not clear how much of this is saber rattling, right? There's things you can do with an executive order. There's things you can't do. There's probably litigation if they did try to do an executive order. So I suspect, you know, in some sense, Twitter labeling 2 of President Trump's tweets, President Trump responding back, I think they're both sort of staking out their position. And probably the most likely scenario is that we'll just continue to see these kinds of skirmishes without necessarily any kind of significant action.
Adolfo, this is typical Donald Trump saber rattling, is it? This would never stand up in court, an attempt to sort of control what social media displays.
Well, I don't know about that, and I think sometimes that saber rattling, the saber is actually used. We'll have to see the content and the scope of the executive order, but there's certainly a lot that can be done regarding these issues. There's actually been quite a bit of bipartisan concern. 2 years ago, during the Russia collusion investigation, for example, Senator Mark Warner here of Virginia, ranking Democrat on a key committee in Washington, D.C., talked about the need to review content and limit content. But I think the bottom line on this, I think Mark Zuckerberg got it right yesterday when he announced that he didn't think Twitter should be the arbiter of what is truth. That is a really dangerous path. And you keep mentioning President Trump. Is Twitter prepared to review the content of every one of its users for fact-checking, and every politician that tends to have views that sometimes can be perceived as something about facts when it's just simply an opinion. And I think, in fact, in this mail fraud issue, it's largely the president's opinion, and he's perfectly entitled to have it. A lot of people suspect that there has been and can be abuse in this area. So I think it's a very dangerous path for Twitter and opens up the floodgates for something that can be very difficult for that platform to regulate. But lastly, there are things that can be done about with the Justice Department within the executive branch for antitrust issues, for example, breaking up these social media giants. And I think that's a big concern. We did it with telephone companies. We've done it with other industries. If it becomes a partisan issue, and Twitter does have a partisan agenda, and it's not Republican.
Okay, well, Derrick, should the social media companies be allowed to police what is put on their platforms?
Yeah, so what I would say is it's really unfortunate that the leader of the free world, arguably the most powerful man in the world, continues to perpetuate, promote falsehoods, mislead the American people, the world, through various social media channels. Let's be honest here. What Twitter did was the bare minimum. As of April 3rd, the Washington Post fact checker has flagged that in the 1,170 days that President Trump has been in office, he has stated 18,000 times either false or misleading statements. And that is what's really the problem here. I think, the platforms have a responsibility. And I think there's this idea that because in some ways it seems democratized, because anyone can go online and say whatever that they want to say, that therefore means that they are actual fair platforms. But the reality is that depending on how much money you have, because you can place ads, given your voice, then you can actually promulgate some of these conspiracy theories and crazy things that President Trump continues to do. And I really think it is a disservice. And so, look, I think there is a responsibility on the social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Donald Trump's campaign has been running misleading and false advertising on both of those platforms. And I actually think Mark Zuckerberg has gotten it wrong. I mean, when they know that the president is lying in his ads, and they do nothing about it, that is a disservice to their to those folks that actually use those platforms and to the American people and our democratic process.
All right, Jim, just help us understand why a tweet about mail-in ballots crossed Twitter's line when so many other tweets haven't. What was the difference?
Well, I think that illustrates the challenge here. I mean, everybody's asking that question, and they have a fairly specific answer, that gets into the sort of arcaneries of their policies. I think it's really striking, though, that they did not take action on all the tweets about Joe Scarborough and him allegedly being involved somehow with the death of a former employee. Those were getting a lot more coverage and attention as being offensive, and including the woman who passed away, her husband, widower, writing into Twitter saying, please take this down, and Twitter refused. Yet they did label the mail-in ballots. And I think their view is that's more of an objective fact. Mail-in balloting has been studied, et cetera. And again, I mean, I think it gets into the challenge here of what truly is a fact versus an opinion is indeed a very slippery slope.
Adolfo, the fairness of the voting process is so crucial and so integral to a democracy. Is there no line that can be crossed when you're posting on Twitter? It's fundamental to America's democracy, the fairness of voting, and there is no evidence that that mail-in ballots have been interfered with even sufficiently to adjust the outcome of an election.
I find it very difficult to believe in a country of 320 million people that never has mail-in ballot ever been abused. So it's a matter of degree and a matter of opinion. I am really quite, as an American, quite shocked to hear some of the comments here by my colleague. I think they're quite dangerous. In a country where liberals have advocated for so long free speech and the ability to have opinions, people can ignore Donald Trump's opinions. And then the fact checkers. Who are the fact checkers and who checks their facts? To say the Washington Post and the New York Times and Twitter, all left-wing, liberal-leaning Democrat organizations, whether they be Republican for that matter, are the fact checkers. My question is, who's fact checking and where are all the publications and retractions of the Washington Post and the New York Times when they get things wrong? This is the problem, and Jim has said it correctly on this program, and Mark Zuckerberg did get it right. I don't think he's a Donald Trump fan. Once you go down this road, are President Obama's comments about you keep your doctor and your healthcare costs are going to go down, and they kept repeating these lies on social media after it was proven by governmental agencies that this wasn't true. I never complained about it. This is just a matter of opinion. So the question is, who is the police here? Do we want to entrust a partisan newspaper in Washington, D.C. to be the fact checker for the American people, or Twitter, which held rallies in favor of Hillary Clinton in its offices and crying when she lost and are now trying to manipulate the election because it has an effective social media platform? The response is simply put your own posts up and say the president's wrong.
Derrick, go ahead. Sorry.
So if I may, I think what's dangerous here is actually continuing to attack the free press, which the president has done since before he got to office. And if we really want to have the conversation about who's being honest here, I don't think Adolfo wants to go there when it comes to Donald Trump. Donald Trump lied about the size of his inauguration crowd. He lied about the impact that COVID would have. 15 people would only die. Now we've just marked the 100,000 threshold, unfortunately, because of his incompetence and terrible leadership.
Okay, but
if
Derrick,
he really wants to talk about the lies.
Derrick, if I may, that argument
lies,
about social media companies being controlled by liberal elites, by people who are liberally minded, why that is the conservative argument against control of what's on social media.
And again, I think we've seen this throughout history. When you don't like the facts, then you try to attack those that are actually reporting them. And I think we've seen that from Donald Trump, and I think that we've seen that from the GOP. And what's ironic here is that Adolfo worked for a man who was actually had integrity, John McCain, and was a truth teller. But the reality is that there are facts and there are opinions, and Donald Trump has continued to put out lies to the American people and to the world. And we actually have to call those things out. And again, when there's a standard for instance, when you put an ad in a campaign and you want to run it on television, there are standards because you cannot put up dishonest ads. And I think that social media platforms have the responsibility to do the same thing. And what Mark Zuckerberg has done is really try to abdicate that responsibility. And that is really problematic.
Okay, Jim.
I have to come.
Adolfo, I'll be back to you in a second, I promise. Jim, is it because it's an election year that Twitter has started to pay a bit more attention? Is that what's happening now? They're worried about what's going to happen in 6 months' time? Or the run-up?
I suspect that has a factor involved here. I mean, this is, if you want to look at it as a trial balloon, we're still 6 months or so out from the election. One could only imagine the level of sort of rancor that would be here if we were the day before the election. So I think Twitter has been receiving a lot of criticism from Democrats and people broadly on the left. Why aren't you doing something? Now we see when they take action, they're going to receive a lot of criticism on the right, and we're going to have to try to find out what the right level is. I do want to say, though, it's really important. President Trump said, hey, I'm being censored. And Adolfo didn't use that word to his credit, but a lot of people say this is censorship. But if you look at what Twitter actually did, they added a label to the bottom of the tweet. There was a little exclamation point, and there was a statement that said, get the facts, right? It didn't say this is a lie. It didn't say we're censoring this. They didn't delete the tweet. They added what they say is context around it. And you can argue whether that's the right approach or not, but it's a fairly mild form of sort of letting people know that there may be another view out there. And I don't expect President Trump or his campaign to like that or support that. But let's be real clear here. There's no censorship going on. And as I've said many times before, if Twitter's trying to censor Donald Trump, they're doing a pretty poor job of it, right? He's got 80 million followers, and he tweets in some cases more than 100 times a day.
All right, Adolfo, just quickly on that point of Jim's, there was no censoring. There was just highlighting the fact that there were alternative views.
Well, I agree. I never used the word censorship. I don't think the president was censored. I think there's a concern that will be the next step. And then, of course, there was a link that was, in my opinion, just a link of a point of view on their to rebuttal that the Twitter itself decided. It went beyond just an advisory. It had a link to other information that I think has an opinion in and of itself. I find it curious, though, that when now we talk about free speech and attack on the press, and Donald Trump attacks the press, the vicious attacks on conservative press, namely the Fox News network in the United States, that seems to be open game. for liberals. But my God, when you attack their point of view, it's sacrosanct. I think Jim's points and your excellent questions about the election are the key here. Everybody knows where Twitter and Silicon Valley stand in Hollywood in the U.S. politically, and Jim's absolutely right. There's an enormous amount of Democrat pressure, and this is an election year. The president's most effective medium has been, and probably his election was thanks to Twitter and social media in general. So there is this pressure. There's a political undertone. Now, I think the path to the executive order that's coming out today and later on is, and I think you're going to see this, there is a lot of pressure that can be applied by the executive branch without law on antitrust matters. And I believe ultimately free press doesn't mean you get to have a monopoly in this country to have one point of view. So if Twitter has a political bias, which it does, and it's monopolizing social media in the country, or Facebook. And I think that is Mark Zuckerberg's concern. He is no fan of Donald Trump, is that we just break up these social media conglomerates and make them smaller, and conservatives have a bigger voice. That's what you'll get as a result of this unfortunate path.
OK. Derrick, do you get a sense that what we've seen in the last few days is a taste of things to come ahead of the election? Donald Trump is a very effective user of social media. How does a Democratic strategist counter that?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things I want to say. One, I think what we're seeing around Donald Trump and what we see by those who continue to support him is this echo chamber of ignorance, where there is conspiracy theories, innuendos, outright falsehoods that are stated, and it's continually perpetuated on outlets like Fox News and others. And I think it's really, really problematic because it's doing a disservice to our democracy. And if I could, real quick, in terms of on the mail ballot piece, I think it's really ironic that the president of the United States, who moved his residence to Florida, voted by mail, is now saying is trying to undermine a very legitimate form of voter engagement. I also think it's ironic that the president of the United States and the GOP have for decades tried to undermine the ability for people to effectively exercise their vote. And that is going to be, I think, a challenge that we as Americans are going to have to really confront. I think as a strategist, one of the things that you have to make sure that you do is continue to put truth out there, continue to hold these folks accountable. And that's not only our elected officials, but I think it's also those that on those platforms. So again, when Facebook purposely allows or knowingly allows false information to be put on their channels by elected officials and say, well, that's free speech, that's problematic. When conservatives want to defend the ability for someone to, it's always ironic that when people want to spew hate, lies, misleading information, it's about free speech. But when people exercise their actual freedoms in terms of actually speaking truth to power, then that's a problem. And I think that's a reality that we're all going to have to continue to face.
Jim, how important will social media be in the run-up to this election? I'm thinking because of the way that rallies may be restricted because of coronavirus concerns, so there'll be less mainstream television exposure for the candidates. How important would social media be in this context?
I think it's incredibly important, both to engage, individual users and prospective voters, but also look at one of the things that Donald Trump has demonstrated the ability to do very well is to control the narrative and the agenda. Look at what we're talking about. And we've done some studies before that show that, yes, he gets a tremendous amount of reach from his tweets. He's got 80 million followers. He tweets quite prolifically. You can sort of figure out what the reach is. But he gets an enormously greater reach from all the media coverage he draws into what he says. So he sort of uses Twitter to set the agenda, to set the conversation, and then everybody, including the media, reacts to that. And that gives him enormous power to sort of set what people are talking about. And he's proven very effective at doing that.
Adolfo, the president is very effective at using Twitter. In the run-up to November, how important will use of social media be, do you think, as I say, because of perhaps restrictions on rallies, concerns about large gatherings, that sort of thing? How will social media play?
Oh, I have to agree with everything Jim has said, and even more so because the president's rallies, which also now only really was having extensive conservative media coverage in the country, the liberal press largely dropped certainly the live coverage of it is less of an opportunity for the president to reach out to particularly his base and his supporters. Of course, it was trending in this way. I have a very good friend, a dear friend, believe it or not, Derrick, on the Biden campaign at the top levels, and even before this situation, they were extremely concerned about the president's effective use of social media and his vast network, and that the advantage that he has is exactly that, and it has proven that in 2016. I do have to correct the record here, and this is the problem, frankly, with when we say facts and truth-telling and fact-checking. The president and the Republicans have never been against absentee ballot, or in fact, even in any way, when you're away from home or work or inability to either vote early or to send in absentees. The president has been doing it. Millions of people have been doing it. There's a difference between this and sending out unsolicited ballots to inactivated voters. And this is the problem right here in this program that has demonstrated what Twitter has gotten itself into. And this is another, with all due respect to you, Derrick, on this, is a bashing of the conservative media as an echo chamber, because it's not your point of view. But when you see the New York Times, the extreme left in this country, in my opinion, and other newspapers, you see them as independent arbiters correcting the facts, or Twitter, when they have a clear political bias, almost stated on their front pages. Right. So this is the problem. This is the problem in if we have a free country, that you cannot have an arbiter of these so-called facts, other than it's a sunny day today or it's the day of the week. This is the problem we face.
So, all right, Derrick, I'll let you come back on that very quickly, but let me, go ahead, first of all, go ahead on.
No, look, I get it. When the facts don't go your way, you don't want people to talk about it. So I understand that. But for anyone to credibly say that Donald Trump has not misled the people, has not lied about things, is just either burying your head in the sand or refusing to acknowledge the reality. And then let me also just say here on the voting piece, if you recall, Donald Trump, when he lost by millions of votes, in the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, set up this voter commission because of fraud, et cetera. Nothing ever came of that because it wasn't a reality. And the fact that I live in Maryland, right across the bridge from Alexandria, and we did receive ballots. We have a Republican governor. We have a Democratic legislature. And any idea or notion that all of a sudden that foments fraud it's absurd. And we have to actually speak truth to power.
Derrick,
and we all have a responsibility.
Time's getting ahead of me, Derrick, but just let me very quickly ask you, Joe Biden is not as good a social media operator as Donald Trump. Is that a concern for the Democrats in the run-up to November?
Listen, I don't think that's as big of a concern, and here's why. If you recall, about a week or so ago, President Obama tweeted one word: vote. And it was not only trending, but it was retweeted millions of times. And so, unfortunately, instead of actually leading the country during a terrible, terrible pandemic that could have been mitigated much better and handled much better, our commander-in-chief is on Twitter. And so I would rather Joe Biden continue to focus on beating Donald Trump, utilizing the platforms that we have. But this election is not going to be won or lost on Twitter.
All right. And finally, can I just ask you, Jim, any likelihood you think that Twitter would ever contemplate removing Donald Trump from his platform? He's too big to block.
That seems wildly unlikely. He's the president of the United States, and so you can have your opinions, you can have your policy, your standards. I think if we think the dust-up we're seeing right now is significant over adding labels to two tweets, if they actually tried to remove him, I think that would be a terrible strategic move for them. I think it's got implications to democracy, and to just say, hey, the president of the United States can't use our platform, I doubt very seriously they would do that.
All right. Unfortunately, gentlemen, we are out of time. But thanks to Adolfo Franco, to Derrick Plummer, and to Jim Anderson. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story, and I am at Jazeera Bernard. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.